Your daughter's coming home from school right now, isn't she? Jake Carson's hands never shook. Not in Fallujah, not in Helmand Province, not during 8 years of driving Chicago's deadliest routes. But when Vincent Torrino said those words at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, everything changed. Welcome to Quiet Tale Studio. Some men drive taxis, others hunt monsters. Tonight, you'll meet the man who does both, and learn what happens when predators make the mistake of threatening his family. Tell us your city in the comments, hit subscribe if you're ready for this ride, because what's about to happen will redefine everything you think you know about justice. Jake Carson had been driving the same route for 8 years. Yellow cab number 447, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Pick up at O'Hare, downtown runs, late-night calls from bars where people made bad decisions and needed rides home to make worse ones. He was invisible. Exactly how he wanted it. At 43, Jake looked like 1,000 other cabbies in Chicago. Weathered face, tired eyes, baseball cap pulled low, flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His hands were calloused from gripping the steering wheel, his back ached from sitting in traffic, and his voice was rough from breathing exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke from passengers who thought rolling down the window was optional. But his hands had other calluses too, ones that came from different kinds of grips. And his eyes, when they caught yours in the rearview mirror, held depths that most people couldn't read and wouldn't want to. The Torrino family didn't know any of this when they slid into his back seat that night. Vincent Torrino sat directly behind Jake, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that cost more than most people's cars. His nephew Anthony rode shotgun on the passenger side, all nervous energy and gold chains that caught the streetlight every time he moved. The other two were muscle, thick necks, suspicious eyes, hands that stayed inside their jackets. "Drive," Vincent said simply. "No please, no address, just a command from a man used to being obeyed." Jake adjusted his rearview mirror and caught Vincent's eyes. "Where to?" "Just drive. We'll tell you when to stop." The city rolled past in neon and shadow. Chicago at midnight was a different animal than Chicago during the day. Hungrier, more honest about what it really was underneath all that architecture and culture. Jake had seen every inch of it from behind this wheel, knew which neighborhoods to avoid, and which corners the cops didn't patrol after 2 a.m. They drove in silence for 20 minutes before Vincent leaned forward. "You know what I do for a living, driver?" Jake kept his eyes on the road. "No, sir. I solve problems. People come to me with situations that the police can't handle, that lawyers can't fix, that require a more direct approach." Vincent's voice was calm, conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "It's a family business, has been for 3 generations. Anthony shifted in his seat, metallic clicking as his jewelry moved. One of the muscle men cracked his knuckles. "Tonight, I have a problem," Vincent continued. "Someone has been interfering with my operations, taking out my people, disrupting my business. They call him the boss. Cute, right? Like there's only room for one boss in this city." Jake said nothing. The speedometer held steady at 35 miles per hour. "This boss, he's good. I'll give him that. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no patterns we can track. He's a ghost. But here's the thing about ghosts, driver. Everyone's afraid of them until you turn on the lights." They stopped at a red light. Jake watched an old woman cross the street, pulling a shopping cart behind her like she was dragging her whole life from one corner to another. "My nephew here thinks we should burn down half the South Side until somebody talks," Vincent said. Anthony grinned, showing teeth that had been fixed too many times. "But I'm a more surgical man. I believe in precision, in finding the right pressure point and applying exactly the right amount of force." The light turned green. Jake pressed the accelerator with the same steady pressure he'd used for 8 years of driving this route. "Turn left here," Vincent instructed. They were heading toward Riverside now, toward the neighborhood where Jake lived in a 2-bedroom house with a mortgage he'd been paying for 12 years. Where his daughter Riley was doing homework at the kitchen table, probably drinking the chocolate milk he'd left for her in the refrigerator before his shift started. Riley was 17, senior year of high school, smart enough for any college in the country if they could afford it. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn streak, and she was the only person in the world who could make Jake Carson smile without trying. She was also the only person in the world who could make him kill without hesitation. Nice neighborhood, Vincent observed as they turned onto Elm Street. Quiet, safe, the kind of place where people mind their own business and nothing bad ever happens. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Micro movements that most people wouldn't notice, but his muscle memory was cataloging every detail now. The weight distribution in the back seat, the angle of Anthony's shoulders, the way the muscle men were positioned. "Stop here," Vincent said. They were parked across the street from Jake's house. The yellow porch light was on, just like always. Riley's bedroom window glowed warm on the second floor. She was probably reading, maybe texting friends, living the normal teenage life that Jake worked 12-hour shifts to provide. "Pretty girl," Vincent said, and Jake's blood turned to ice water. "What is she, 16? 17? That's a dangerous age for a young lady. Lots of things can happen to teenage girls in a city like Chicago. Car accidents, drug overdoses. Sometimes they just disappear." Jake's breathing didn't change. His heart rate didn't spike. 8 years of driving a taxi in Chicago had taught him to control his reactions, to stay calm when drunk passengers got aggressive, or when someone tried to rob him at a stoplight. But this wasn't about money or territory or professional rivalry. This was about Riley. "Here's what's going to happen, driver," Vincent continued. "You're going to help us send a message to the boss. We know he cares about innocent people. It's his weakness. So we're going to hurt some innocent people until he comes out of hiding." Anthony pulled out his cell phone and started scrolling through photos. "We've got a whole list. Teachers, shop owners, families with kids. But teenagers are always the most effective. They scream louder." Jake caught Anthony's eyes in the rearview mirror. "What do you want me to do?" "Smart question. We want you to drive us to 3 addresses tonight. At each stop, we're going to collect someone. Nothing fatal. We're not animals, just enough damage to get the boss's attention." Vincent leaned forward until his breath fogged the safety partition. "And if you're thinking about being a hero, remember that we know where you live now. We know about your daughter. One phone call from me, and she'll disappear before you can say her name." That's when Jake Carson made his decision. It wasn't a conscious choice, not something he weighed or considered. It was instinct, muscle memory, the activation of training that had been burned into his nervous system 15 years ago, in places whose names were still classified. Jake had died on paper in 2009. Marine Force Reconnaissance. Task Force 121. Classified operations in countries that didn't officially exist on any map. His file had been sealed, his service record buried so deep that only 3 people in the Pentagon knew what Jake Carson had really done for his country. For 8 years, he'd been just a taxi driver, a single father trying to give his daughter a normal life, to forget the weight of things he'd done in places that smelled like burning oil and spent brass. But Vincent Torrino had just threatened Riley. And Jake Carson, the taxi driver, the invisible man, the father who left chocolate milk in the refrigerator and helped with calculus homework, was about to remember exactly who he used to be. "Turn around," Jake said quietly. "Excuse me?" Vincent's voice carried surprise and the first edge of irritation. "I said turn around." Jake's voice was different now, lower, colder, carrying a weight that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "All of you, turn around and look at me." Something in his tone made them comply. Even the muscle men, even Anthony, with his nervous energy and gold chains, even Vincent Torrino, who hadn't taken orders from anyone in 20 years. But before I was Jake Carson, I was Gunnery Sergeant Jacob Cross, Marine Force Reconnaissance, Classified Operations 2001 to 2009. 47 confirmed kills, 16 successful extractions, 3 missions that will never be declassified. Anthony's hand was halfway to his gun when Jake's eyes locked onto his in the mirror. In the Corps, they called me the boss. Not because I gave orders, but because when the boss showed up, problems got solved. Permanently. The silence in the taxi was absolute. Outside, Chicago continued its nightly rhythm of sirens and traffic and people living their lives, but inside the cab, time had stopped. "You just threatened my daughter," Jake said. "That was a mistake." Vincent found his voice first. "Listen, friend, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." Jake's hand moved to the gear shift, but his eyes stayed on the mirror. "You said you wanted to send a message to the boss. Consider it delivered." What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Jake yanked the gear shift into reverse and floored the accelerator. The taxi shot backward across the street, tires screaming, and slammed into the concrete barrier at the edge of Riverside Park. The impact threw all four passengers forward, stunning them, giving Jake the half-second he needed. He was out of the driver's seat and moving before the engine stopped smoking. The passenger door opened, and Anthony tumbled out, dazed, his hand still reaching for a gun he'd never draw. Jake's elbow connected with Anthony's temple and he dropped like a bag of cement. The first muscle man was climbing out of the back seat when Jake's knee found his solar plexus. The man folded forward, gasping, and Jake's forearm wrapped around his throat in a sleeper hold that would have him unconscious in 8 seconds. 7. 6. 5. The man went limp. Vincent Torrino was screaming something about backup, about phone calls, about how Jake was a dead man. The second muscle man had his gun halfway out when Jake's hand found his wrist and twisted. The pop of breaking bones was audible over Vincent shouting. The gun clattered onto the sidewalk. The muscle man followed it, clutching his wrist and trying not to scream. That left Vincent. Jake opened the rear passenger door and looked at the man who had threatened his daughter. Vincent Torrino, 3 generations of organized crime, a man who solved problems with violence and intimidation, was pressed against the far window like he was trying to phase through the glass. "Please," Vincent whispered. "I didn't know. We can work this out." Jake reached into the back seat and grabbed Vincent by his expensive tie. With one smooth motion, he pulled the crime boss out of the taxi and onto the sidewalk. "You're going to listen very carefully," Jake said, his voice still that same quiet whisper, "because I'm only going to say this once." Vincent nodded frantically. "You're going to get your broken soldiers off my street. You're going to forget my name, my address, and my daughter's existence. You're going to tell every bottom feeder in your organization that Riverside is off limits." Jake leaned closer, until Vincent could smell the coffee on his breath and count the gray hairs in his stubble. "And if I ever see any member of the Torrino family within 10 blocks of my house again, I will do to you what I did to the Barak-Sai cartel in Helmand province." Vincent's eyes went wide. Even criminals had heard whispers about what happened to the Barak-Sai cartel. 300 men, wiped out in a single night, their compound left burning in the desert with no survivors. "Do we understand each other?" Jake asked. Vincent nodded so hard it looked like his neck might snap. "Good." Jake released his tie and stepped back. "Now get your people and get out of my neighborhood." Vincent scrambled to collect his nephew and his muscle man. Anthony was conscious but wobbly, sporting a bruise that would cover half his face by morning. The first muscle man was awake but disoriented. The second was still whimpering about his broken wrist. They limped away into the night, Vincent casting terrified glances over his shoulder every few steps. Jake watched them disappear around the corner, then turned to assess his taxi. The rear bumper was crumpled, the trunk was dented, and steam was rising from under the hood. But it would run long enough to get him to Mickey's garage, where questions weren't asked and cash was preferred over paperwork. He was pulling out his cell phone to call for a tow when he heard footsteps behind him. "Dad?" Jake turned around. Riley was standing on the front porch in her pajamas and slippers, holding a baseball bat like she was ready to use it. "I heard the crash," she said. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Jake just looked at his daughter. 17 years old, brave enough to come outside with a baseball bat when she heard trouble. Smart enough to ask questions but wise enough not to ask too many. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said. "Just a little fender bender, nothing to worry about." Riley studied his face, the same way she'd been doing since she was 8 years old, and figured out that her dad was different from other dads. That he moved differently, thought differently, carried himself like someone who'd seen things that most people only had nightmares about. "Okay," she said finally. "But next time maybe warn me before you play demolition derby in front of our house?" Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in 8 hours. "Deal." She turned to go back inside, then paused. "Dad, I love you." "I love you too, Riley, more than you know." She disappeared into the house, and Jake was alone on the sidewalk with his wrecked taxi and the lingering smell of fear that Vincent Torrino's crew had left behind. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Mickey, it's Jake, I need a favor." The next morning, Vincent Torrino sat in his office above Torrino's restaurant on the north side, holding an ice pack to the bruise on his ribs and trying to explain to his underboss why 4 grown men had been humiliated by a taxi driver. His name is Jake Carson, Vincent said for the 3rd time, lives on Elm Street in Riverside, drives yellow cab 447. And you want us to hit him? Asked Tommy Benedetto, a man whose solution to every problem involved gasoline and matches. No, Vincent said quickly. We stay away from him, far away. Boss, with respect, 1 cabbie took out 4 of our guys. We can't let that stand. Vincent set down the ice pack and looked at Tommy with the patient expression of a man explaining fire safety to a child playing with matches. Tommy, what do you know about Marine Force reconnaissance? Some kind of special forces, right? The most elite special operations unit in the Marine Corps. They go places other soldiers can't go, do things other soldiers can't do. They're ghosts, Tommy. Invisible until they want to be seen. Vincent walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about eyes in a rearview mirror and a voice that could freeze blood. Jake Carson used to be one of them, and before that, when he was operational, they called him the boss. Tommy's face went pale. The guy we've been looking for? The one who's been taking out our operations? The same one we drove to his house and threatened his daughter in front of, Vincent confirmed. So no, Tommy, we're not going to hit him, we're going to pretend he doesn't exist, and we're going to pray he extends us the same courtesy. Vincent turned back to his desk, where a stack of incident reports detailed 3 months of systematic dismantling of Torrino family operations. Witnesses who disappeared, shipments that vanished, soldiers who simply stopped reporting in. All the work of a ghost who drove a taxi and helped his daughter with calculus homework. But what about our reputation? Tommy asked. People will think we're weak. Vincent picked up the top report from his desk. 2 soldiers found tied up in a warehouse with a note that simply read, "Find a new line of work," and handed it to Tommy. Our reputation will be that we're smart enough to recognize when we're outclassed, Vincent said. And that we're wise enough to walk away when walking away is an option. He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. Besides, Tommy, Jake Carson gave us a gift last night. He could have killed all 4 of us and buried the bodies where they'd never be found. Instead, he let us live. That's not weakness. That's a professional courtesy from one predator to another. Vincent opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder labeled "The Boss Ongoing Investigation." Without ceremony, he dropped it into the trash can beside his desk. As of right now, the Torrino family has no interest in identifying or apprehending the individual known as the boss. Case closed. Tommy stared at the folder in the trash. Just like that? Just like that. 3 weeks later, Jake Carson was driving his morning route when his radio crackled with a pickup request from O'Hare International. Terminal 3, curbside pickup, destination downtown. He pulled up to the designated spot and waited. A man in an expensive suit climbed into the back seat. Not Vincent Torrino, but someone who carried himself with the same dangerous confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Carson," the man said. Jake adjusted his rearview mirror. "Do I know you?" "Agent David Walsh, FBI. I was hoping we could have a conversation." Jake put the taxi in drive and pulled away from the curb. About what? About the sudden cessation of Torrino family activities in your neighborhood. About Vincent Torrino's decision to close down 3 major operations and move his base of business to Milwaukee. About the remarkable coincidence that all of this happened right after a certain taxi driver had a traffic accident on Elm Street. They drove in silence for several minutes. Chicago morning traffic gave Jake plenty of time to think, to weigh his options, to decide how much truth Agent Walsh could handle. "Sounds like the FB. I should be thanking Vincent Torrino for being such a good citizen," Jake said finally. Walsh chuckled. "The Bureau has been trying to build a case against the Torrino family for 6 years. Then suddenly overnight they pack up and leave Chicago like the city's on fire. That's the kind of coincidence that makes federal agents very curious. Maybe they just wanted a change of scenery. Maybe. Or maybe someone convinced them that Chicago wasn't healthy for their business anymore." Jake caught Walsh's eyes in the mirror. If someone did convince them of that, hypothetically speaking, wouldn't that be a good thing for the city? Hypothetically, yes. Practically, it creates complications. When one crime family leaves a territory, others move in to fill the vacuum. The Torrinos were brutal, but they were predictable. What comes next might be worse. They pulled up to the FBI building downtown. Walsh made no move to get out. "I'm not here to arrest you, Mr. Carson. I'm here to offer you a job." Jake turned around in his seat for the first time during the ride. "Excuse me?" "The Bureau has been watching you for 3 years. Ever since the Barakzai cartel incident in Afghanistan started showing up in classified briefings. We know who you used to be, and we know what you're capable of." Walsh pulled out a business card and set it on the passenger seat. "Chicago has a problem with organized crime. You've proven that you can solve that problem efficiently and quietly. We'd like to make it official." Jake looked at the card but didn't pick it up. "I'm retired, Agent Walsh. I drive a taxi. I have a daughter who needs me to be her father, not a weapon." "I understand. But consider this. Working with us would give you resources, backup, legal protection. And it would let you do what you're already doing, just with federal support instead of improvisation." Walsh opened the door but paused before getting out. "Think about it, Mr. Carson. Chicago needs men like you, men who can walk in the shadows and solve problems that courtrooms can't touch." He climbed out of the taxi and walked toward the federal building, leaving his business card on the passenger seat like a question mark waiting for an answer. Jake sat in his idling taxi for a long moment, watching government agents and office workers stream into the building, thinking about Riley's college applications and the mortgage payments and the choice between being a father and being a soldier. Then he picked up the business card, read it once, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Some decisions couldn't be made in a single morning, but some possibilities were worth considering. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table helping Riley with her calculus homework, the same routine they'd maintained for 3 years. She worked through equations while he checked her answers and tried not to think about the weight of Agent Walsh's business card in his pocket. "Dad?" Riley said without looking up from her textbook. "Yeah, sweetheart? I know you're not really just a taxi driver." Jake's pen stopped moving. "What do you mean?" Riley set down her pencil and looked at him with the direct, unflinching gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "I mean, I know you're more than that. I've always known, normal taxi drivers don't move the way you move. They don't notice everything the way you notice everything. And they definitely don't win 4-against-1 fights in front of their house and then act like it's no big deal." Jake studied his daughter's face, seeing his wife's intelligence and his own stubborn honesty looking back at him. "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. "I want to know if you're safe. I want to know if we're safe. And I want to know if there's anything I can do to help." Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "You help by being exactly who you are, by getting good grades and applying to colleges and living a normal teenage life. That's all I need from you. But what about what you need for you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Jake wasn't sure he was ready to face. "I need to know that you're safe and happy," he said finally. "Everything else is just details." Riley squeezed his hand. "I am safe, Dad, because I have you. And I'll be happy as long as I know you're doing what you're supposed to be doing." "And what am I supposed to be doing?" She smiled, the same smile that had been melting his heart since she was 2 years old and learned to say, "Daddy." "Whatever it takes to keep the bad guys away from people like me." That night, after Riley went to bed, Jake sat on his front porch and pulled Agent Walsh's business card from his pocket. He read it again in the yellow glow of the porch light, thinking about choices and consequences and the weight of doing what you're good at versus doing what's safe. Chicago spread out before him in all directions, 8 million people living their lives, most of them never knowing how close danger came to their doorsteps or who stood between them and the darkness. Jake Carson had spent 8 years trying to be invisible, trying to be nobody special, trying to give his daughter a normal life in a normal house on a normal street. But some people aren't meant to be invisible. Some people carry skills that the world needs, whether they want to use them or not. Jake pulled out his cell phone and dialed the number on Agent Walsh's card. "Walsh? Agent Walsh? This is Jake Carson. I'd like to discuss that job offer." There was a pause then. "I'll pick you up tomorrow morning. We have a lot to talk about." Jake hung up the phone and looked at his house, at the warm light spilling from Riley's bedroom window, at the life he'd built from scratch after his old life ended in classified files and sealed records. Tomorrow, he would start becoming something new again. Not just a taxi driver, not just the boss, but something in between. A man who could walk in both worlds, who could be a father at dinner and a guardian angel after dark. Chicago was about to get a lot safer. And Vincent Torrino, 300 miles away in Milwaukee, would sleep a little easier knowing that Jake Carson was hunting bigger predators now. Some men are born to drive taxis. Others are born to stand between innocent people and the darkness that wants to swallow them. Jake Carson had spent 8 years pretending to be the first kind of man. Now it was time to remember what it felt like to be the second. This story was brought to you by Quiet Tale Studio. Before you go, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who seemed ordinary on the surface, but you suspected they were capable of extraordinary things? Someone who carried themselves like they had secrets worth keeping? Tell us about them in the comments below. And if you believe that some protectors work best in the shadows, subscribe to our channel for more stories about the guardians most people never see. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody notices until it's too late.